Welcome to American Beauty. I'm Joanna Brooks, and this is a podcast about the beautiful but challenging work of democracy in our moment. Every episode, I focus in on a question or a concern raised by a listener like you about where we've been and where we're going, and I bring in experts, women, who can help us see more clearly, breathe more deeply, and get grounded for the work ahead. It's a conversation in 3 parts. I always vote, and I always will, but I'm worried about the impact and integrity of our votes. Emily Sokoloff believes in voting. Really believes in voting. She lives in Austin, Texas, and on the day we talk via Skype, it's raining.
We're having flooding in Austin. It's been unbelievable, and I'm late coming home. I was driving in. It's beyond belief. It's biblical.
Of course, Emily is not from Texas. She's from Brooklyn. She's a trained folklorist with expertise in both Mexican and Yiddish folk cultures. She's multilingual. She has gorgeous curly white hair. And to her, voting has always been something very important.
Because I take my daughter, now my daughter, of course, is 29 and about to get a master's on Thursday. So but I remember bringing her with me into the voting booth from the time that she was born. And it's that kind of sense of a sacred duty for somebody who is pretty much secular, culturally Jewish, but pretty much not a theist.
She's felt this way as long as she can remember.
I do remember the Kennedy election. I remember when Johnson was running, and I remember when I was in, I guess it would be the equivalent of junior high, having like all of these buttons on this cape that I wore with political buttons. But I was never the kind of person that wanted to become a delegate or wanted to become like really involved with a party per se.
Right.
So
you wanted to be in the sacred space of voting.
Yes.
She doesn't know exactly the date or year when she cast her first vote, but she does remember viscerally how it felt.
If you asked me to describe the inside of a mid-century voting booth in Borough Hall in Brooklyn, I could do that. But we used to have these great like UNIVAC machine looking booths that you would get into, and you would move a big lever like an elevator operator in the old days, and it would close a velvet curtain. So it was kind of like a blackout booth, and you'd have a digital a panel of buttons in front of you. Digital is actually, in the old sense of digital,
right.
But I guess now it's analog. And you'd actually physically move things. And then when you moved back the lever, it would not only open the curtain, but it would register everything that you'd done inside the booth. And I think there was this amazing window on the outside of the booth, very Wizard of Oz-like, that would show your number would shift in the odometer, and there would be a flash of it was a visual sign. There was no light involved.
Wow.
I remember the booth having kind of like a piano light inside. So it was very, there was something very magical and mysterious about going into that.
And these are the things she thinks about as a voter registration and election protection volunteer: how voting feels and how that impacts civic engagement.
We vote on these tablets, and I don't know what they do in California, but in Texas now you have a tablet with this kind of wheel and arrow buttons, and it's very confusing. And I don't know how people that aren't computer literate, I mean, if you don't know how to basically work a computer, I don't know how you even do it. And I've actually helped people vote, mostly because they spoke Spanish and didn't speak English, and so they needed help sort of maneuvering, but also because of the strangeness of the technology. And I wonder if maybe it's, the voting apparatus has evolved the way the automobile has evolved, and can sort of understand how to fix things and how things worked in a very tactile way, and now you can't.
We have Sharpie markers. We have Sharpie markers and paper ballots that are in folders that we carry into a cardboard booth, and then we carry back, and they put in a big box. It's very tactile, but not digital. Not digital.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Because, in third world countries, not only do you vote on paper and does everybody watch, you actually put it into the slot of a box, but you also get your finger dyed.
You get your thumb inked, yeah.
Right. So there's this kind of process of the visibility. Here, what we get is a sticker that says I voted, or in Texas, yo voté,
Yeah. Emily started volunteering years ago to help with voter registration.
In Texas, you need to be certified, and you need to have a training. So I've done that for the years in Texas. I probably did it in the 90s when we lived in Texas. I register people that I know are not going to vote for the progressives. I register. My goal is to get as many people involved as possible.
About a decade ago, she started doing a more specialized kind of work called election protection. It involves going into polling places and helping voters one by one resolve challenges that might come up. She worked in Pennsylvania in the 2004, 2008, and 2012 election.
With my Spanish, was able to help an older Portuguese couple vote. And this was in the Rust Belt. I would go to Bethlehem, Reading, and Allentown from New York City, and basically ask people, were you able to vote when they came out of the voting booth? And this couple had not been able to vote, and they were standing, and they were holding a paper, and they were saying, Kerry. They wanted to vote for Kerry. So I was able to go back in with them and help adjudicate their process. There are all kinds of things that make it difficult for people that can't navigate the system easily to communicate in the voting environment.
For November 2016, Emily was back in Texas.
I kind of made it my business to try to work particularly with the disenfranchised. So I worked at a lot of homeless shelters, at food pantries. I worked in high schools, and particularly in high school programs with non-traditional students that have been sort of kind of bounced out of the academic track. I tried to work with people that in some sense consider themselves disenfranchised, to re-enfranchise them. Now, of course, you don't know whether these people are going to actually end up voting. But the important thing is the inclusiveness of the process.
Emily has a unique, up-close working knowledge of the kinds of things that can derail the voting process when people show up at the polls.
In election protection, I think that just having the personal authority to tell somebody who is saying, I'm sorry, your name is not on the list, or I'm sorry, we have an address problem or with where you lived before, or I'm sorry, you've moved and you're no longer, your ID doesn't match, or it's to push past that and say, well, I'm sorry that's what your records show, but in fact, I have a receipt in my wallet from when I was registered, or I voted before here and I want to speak to the judge, because there's usually a judge at every polling place. So I think it's a question of a sense of entitlement and a sense of pushing through that resistance. When someone looks at you crossways and says, you're not on my list, or our name, we have your name spelled this way and you're insisting it's spelled another way, that it takes a certain sense of ownership in that process to go beyond that and say,
and if you already feel vulnerable or marginalized, you might not have the energy that day or the wherewithal. You might have fear, right?
Absolutely.
And that's where someone like you plays a role. You step in and you're the advocate. She also knows the barriers that keep people from just getting there. In many countries, voting day is a national holiday, not here, and that can make it tough for people who work long hours. It can also be tough for people who don't have a stable address or those who move frequently. Requirements for identification are another big barrier, especially when studies have shown that 11% of American citizens, about 20 million eligible voters, don't possess a state-issued ID. Those rates are even higher in communities of color.
For the last election, I was very curious about this voter ID that you can get from the Department of Motor Vehicles, and so I went through the process of getting one. And this is the sort of supposedly easiest way to get some kind of identification if you don't have a driver's license, if you don't have a passport, if you don't have all those things that are, in a sense, markers of a certain level of economic attainment. You wouldn't, if you had no prospect of driving a car, you might let your learner's permit lapse or your driver's license lapse, and the same with a passport if there is no traveling in your future. So I sort of went through this process, and you do need a birth certificate. You need something. If you've lost everything, if somebody, like the people, for instance, I keep returning to the homeless, but if somebody has robbed all your stuff, which is something that I've heard a lot of, right, then you don't have the documentation that's going to enable you to get what you need and to be able to vote. So, it took me, I don't know, about 5 hours with all of the documentation to be able to get that card from the Department of Motor Vehicles. So there's a hurdle right there. You need to have that.
But perhaps the biggest barrier, the most significant barrier Emily finds, is something more fundamental. It's the broken relationships that constitute a lack of faith in democracy.
I had a woman, and I came to her house and I said, "Have you gotten to vote yet?" And she said, "I'm taking down my Halloween decorations." And I said, "Well, you can vote right up there at the shrine, whatever center it is." And, she said, "I'm taking down my Halloween decorations." And I said, "Well, I'm happy to give you a lift or come back at another time. The polls are open till 7. And she was like, she was taking down her Halloween decorations. And there was nothing I could do. I wasn't in a position to get on a high horse and tell her that people had sacrificed their lives for her right to vote. She was female, she was African American, and I was just not about to go there. And but that's where it's at. I mean, if you don't see it as being that important, and there are a lot of people that do not consider themselves enfranchised by their own decree. It's not a question of what's, and that's our problem. That's very problematic. The people that say my vote doesn't matter or I've never voted.
And sometimes the way we think about elections, about how to get people to the polls, about how to make elections more safe, more secure, might actually hurt as much as they help. Last election season, in 2016, both major parties raised issues of the integrity of the vote. And on the one side, it was unsubstantiated, but very vocal allegations of massive voter fraud.
Right.
With the implication that it was happening in immigrant communities. On the other side, there was a sort of micro data tech focus on 3 counties in the upper Midwest where Facebook ads had, influenced voter conduct or had agitated certain subsets and swung the vote, right? So on the one side, this very broad voter integrity allegation, and on the other side, a very, geeky, micro-focused. Are you worried about Facebook And are you worried about massive voter fraud? Are these the things that, as someone who works every day in the trenches, that ride on your mind?
Well, I am worried about the sort of bean counting, logarithm driven approach to electoral politics that I'm seeing. I mean, I think that there are a lot of there's a tendency, on my own side of the Democratic Party, for instance, to take a very sort of reductionist, mechanized, just sort of what you're describing.
It's a game. I work to get out the vote. It's a game. And if we make it through our clipboards and make all these phone calls and hit these targets and numbers, and that's a way of rationalizing. But it sounds like you're pointing us to something much deeper. Absolutely.
Where you get somebody who's decided that the way to do things is simply door knocking and cold calling, and that is the only thing to do. And that's the thing that I, as an activist, election activist, enjoy doing the least. And that the people that are the recipients of these actions enjoy having happen to them the least of anything possible. So yes, and in terms of social media in general and what its influence is, which is your other question about, the Facebook phenomenon and the robo, I can't remember what they're called anymore. The sort of
the bot-driven content from Russia to make people angry. Yeah,
right. All of that. I mean, we're very susceptible as human beings to all kinds of influences. My counter to it, and also to the bean counting and sort of data-driven approach is, returning to that human touch, the piece of paper that gets dropped in a slot, and to a real grassroots-based interactive model, which, that's how you're going to address these issues. I definitely, in canvassing door to door in Latino neighborhoods, heard, but wait, Hillary wants, to kill babies in utero that are, 9 months old. And Hillary, so how else are you going to counter those kinds of attitudes without just it's much more laborious, obviously, than having your cell phone automatically text 20 people a day. But it's certainly going to have a more of a long-term effect, and it's going to have, I think, more of a more deeply persuasive quality. So
it's something about relationships rather than algorithms.
Something about it, yes.
Kind of democratic in that way.
Yes.
What's really at stake in the electoral process? Are we worrying about the wrong things? Beyond winning and losing, beyond data, bots, and cold calling, what really moves people to engage? And what derails engagement? What would it take to move the United States towards greater integrity in our elections? And what would it mean to restore what Emily describes as a sense of the sacred or the human touch? In part 2, we'll take these questions to 3 women, including an award-winning poet recognized as a fearless truth-teller who may change the way you see elections forever. This is American Beauty. I'm Joanna Brooks. Please stick with us. Subscribe, share, rate, and review today at iTunes. Follow us on Twitter and Insta at _Joanna Brooks. Check in at AmericanBeautyPodcast.com. Thanks to Rachel Taylor for sound production, K Studio for brand design, and to all the women doing the work.